I'm delighted to be here, not just to inaugurate this class and this series, and not just because I'm surrounded by good friends, including my wife, Joan Fitzgerald, who teaches here, but I'm especially glad to be here because 4 hours ago I was sitting on a runway in Washington, D.C., and I was concerned that I might be late to my own lecture. Fortuitously, I don't do PowerPoints. I remember Lord Acton's maxim. You all remember it: power corrupts and PowerPoints corrupt absolutely. So my subject is why do we keep winning the argument and losing the politics? After all, for most of American history, not just since Franklin Roosevelt, we have relied on government to complement and also to housebreak the private market. Since the era of Jefferson and Hamilton, government has underwritten new technology and education. It's built roads, it's built railroads, it's built canals, airports, electric power systems, and it distributed the land that created a republic of freeholders. And of course, government does not just provide goods and services. Government is the platform of political democracy. It is the instrument through which we express our choices as citizens. Now, since Roosevelt, government, of course, has also provided valued forms of social insurance, such as Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. And the market proves over and over again that it can be a great force for innovation and choice, but contrary to free market theory, the government is also an engine of great inequality in the way market forces distribute rewards, and it is not even efficient in the terms that free market advocates claim. You need government to deliver all the things that the private market finds unprofitable to deliver, or prices wrong, everything from education to health to research to infrastructure to clean air and water to safe work environments and to reliable aggregate demand. Even more importantly, despite what you may have read, free markets turn out to be not self-regulating, especially financial markets. And every once in a while, 1929, 2008, history demonstrates that with an exclamation point. Now, you would think that the financial collapse of 2008 and the deflation that followed, and by the way, this is not a great recession, this is a deflation. A recession is a business cycle event. What we are in is more like a depression. The economy was not in depression in the technical sense for most of the 1930s. Economic growth resumed in 1933, but it was in a deflationary depression, which is what we're in now. So you would think that the collapse of 2008 would have provided a pretty good teachable moment for the proposition that markets are not, in fact, self-regulating. The crash should have produced a massive political defeat for the conservative ideology whose resurgence began 3 decades ago. Its signal achievement, liberated finance, did not reward efficient innovation or produce broadly based prosperity. Rather, the result was a severe speculative bubble followed by an equally severe crash. And along the way, in the run-up to the crash, the super rich captured a more and more disproportionate share of the total economic rewards while other incomes stagnated. One really interesting detail is that Keynesianism, the management of aggregate demand, was privatized. Instead of government managing demand, consumers borrowed to maintain their living standards in the face of stagnant or declining wages. Banks and corporations also borrowed to finance speculative activities or to bid up their own stock price. And the Federal Reserve, which combined loose money with even looser regulation, ended up facilitating the bubble. Now, in the aftermath, there has been a great unwinding. Ordinary people have suffered large losses of earnings, assets, and social protections, as well as hopes for their children. So by any measure, 2008 was primed to be a political watershed on a par with 1933. But 3 years after the financial dominoes fell, right-wing ideas are ascendant, right-wing policies reign, and further right social movements are on the march. Instead of delivering reform and recovery, governing elites are delivering austerity. And as the economy keeps sinking, progressivism is on the defensive almost everywhere. In most Western countries, center-right coalitions govern, and far-right movements are on the march. Now I ask you, how could this have happened? If laissez-faire could not be reversed as a practical and theoretical failure after a second massive financial crash on the conservative watch, when can we ever hope to rebuild a broad popular constituency for a managed form of capitalism? The explanations cannot be idiosyncratic or personal. Barack Obama's conciliatory temperament, Gordon Brown's dour manner, Strauss-Kahn's unfortunate libido. Patterns are too pervasive. The story has to be deeply structural. Now, you also have to be very careful of language when you talk about markets, because this is not governments versus free markets in an abstract textbook sense. It is the democratic polity versus the immense political power of private corporations and banks. Because as we've seen, bankers do not like government regulation, except when they need to be bailed out. And then they're all in favor of activist government. And then when they return to profitability, they turn right around and oppose government regulation all over again. Problem with bailouts is if you believe in free markets, one of the requirements of a free market is that failures need to be allowed to fail. Otherwise, the incentive system that discourages taking on catastrophic risk also fails, and business ends up privatizing the gain and socializing the loss. So this has to be a story of political power. It's not just a story of bad economic theory. The resurgence of laissez-faire in the past 3 or 4 decades did not just lead to economic inequality, it led to heightened political inequality. All of the countervailing institutions of which John Kenneth Galbraith spoke, like trade unions, and actively engaged citizens and mutual associations, and all of the constituencies for a managed form of capitalism were progressively weakened as private commercial forces strengthened. And the whole thing fed on itself. It undermined the credibility of government. It undermined the clarity of the message of the Democratic Party. And as people became less convinced that government could help them, they became converts increasingly to the ideology that we just ought to get government out of the way. Now, since this is the first week after Labor Day, I want to follow the venerable tradition of telling you a little bit about what I did on my summer vacation. You will see the relevance of this in a moment. Joan and I spent some of August in the Berkshires, where we listened to a lot of music at Tanglewood. And we particularly listened to the music of Johannes Brahms. And we became very interested in his life, as well as his music, and we learned something about the milieu in which Brahms lived and worked. And I got to thinking that in 1885, the year that Brahms finished his magnificent Fourth Symphony, Germany was on top of the world. The German language was spoken in a 1,000-mile belt that went from Königsberg, which is now part of Russia, to Strasbourg, which is now a part of France. And Bismarck had invented the welfare state. And in addition to German music and German literature, Germany was celebrated for its science and engineering. Of course, Germany was more than one country, but the German-speaking countries were on the verge of surpassing Britain as the world's leading industrial power. All things German were admired. My own grandfather, who came to this country in 1878 from the Polish town of Kuttner, where they spelled the name Kuttner with one T, added a second T because he thought it was more prestigious to spell it the German way. But the culturally advanced German version of the Enlightenment had one small important hole. They never quite figured out liberal constitutional government or liberal civil society. Not only did the German-speaking principalities have autocratic governments, but they were beset with Kulturkampf, culture wars, with irreconcilable differences. To use a famous formulation of the political philosopher Albert Hirschman, everything was about passions rather than interests. And the difference between passions and interests, Hirschman explained, was that interests can be brokered and reconciled, while passions cannot. And German civic institutions were far too weak to broker passions into a national consensus. German liberalism was weak and shallow. And in the year 1848, liberal democratic and national revolutions broke out all over Europe, and they were quickly crushed by autocratic status quo regimes, nowhere with more brutality than in Germany. And the historian H.A.P. Taylor, speaking of that moment, described it as a time when history reached a turning point and failed to turn. Meanwhile, over in America, they were not quite so advanced in music or engineering, but the Americans of the late 18th century had invented something that was the envy of the world: liberal constitutional government. The American Constitution carefully balanced constraints on tyranny with a state strong enough to govern. One novelty, winning majorities did not treat losing minorities as traitors. The loyal opposition would live to govern another day, and in the meantime it would play a constructive role. Another innovation, religion, the object of brutal promotion and suppression in Europe, was kept in a private realm, with the intended paradoxical result that Americans became the most religious of people. Civic republicanism, the active engagement of the citizenry, and the enterprise of self-government flourished. Now, America's Constitution was, of course, a work in progress, still to be addressed after 1789 with the shame of slavery and the casualties of the Industrial Revolution, the periodic financial panics and depressions. And though the Constitution's bias was against government activism, nonetheless, in emergencies, the government was strong enough to govern, and after Roosevelt, the government took on new responsibilities with the broad consent and even acclaim of the governed. Well, today, America in the Tea Party era feels more like 19th century Germany. Contending passions cannot be brokered in the national interest. Passion trumps reason. Faith overrules science. And ordinary policy differences are occasions for a Kulturkampf. And people who disagree are branded as traitors. One of the two major parties has turned nihilist, giddily toying with default on the nation's debt, reveling in the dark pleasures of fiscal Walpurgisnacht, and government itself as the devil. Now, the demons of 19th century Germany were only guardians of the gates of hell that was to come. And America, by contrast, has always relied on the genius of constitutional government. But the right's reckless assault on constitutional government is really unprecedented. It is a war, in a sense, on America. And you have to ask how this happened. Now, there are some critics who believe that the American Constitution, with its multiple veto points, its checks and balances, is just too anti-democratic. That it was a kind of a time bomb, waiting for the right brew of circumstances. Too anti-democratic, too anti-majoritarian. And if you think that the state is necessary to tame the market, you need a competent state. Critics from Hendrik Hertzberg at the New Yorker to Harold Meyerson in the current cover story in the American Prospect, to scholars such as Juan Linz and James McGregor Burns, have argued that the Founding Fathers, in a sense, got it wrong. And here's the cover of the Prospect with Meyerson's piece, and it's Washington saying, "Oops," and the cover line is, "Did the Founders screw up?" I think that's not quite right. You know, at other precarious times in the nation's history, when you had strong leaders, Franklin Roosevelt could do what was necessary to rally public opinion and not only get us past the Great Depression, but develop a whole system of social insurance and then go on to win World War II. Lyndon Johnson could seize the moment and redeem the promises of Lincoln to pass law after law after law so that blacks could finally be full citizens and the system of state-sponsored terror in the South could finally be slain. But it does take strong leaders in moments of crisis, and only once before in the history of the American Republic has the Constitution, in a sense, proved an insurmountable blockage to solving a national crisis, namely slavery, which had to be solved by a civil war. And in thinking about what it is about the mix of our Constitution and our politics that has led to this moment of extreme blockage, it occurred to me that a big part of the story is that European countries not only have stronger states, which you do need if you're going to have countervailing institutions to harness capitalism in the broad public interest, but they also have parliamentary systems that, for the most part, use proportional representation. Now, what does that mean? It means that you have multi-party systems that form coalitions, and it means that if you are a radical right populist party, you don't get to be part of the government. The center right and the center left, and that's what's going on in Europe today, mostly led by the center right, come together and they form a government. And depending on which European country you're talking about, the radical right, anti-immigrant populist parties get 10, 15, 20, in Austria it's 28% of the vote, but they don't get to be part of the government. Now you compare that with America today, where we have a two-party presidential system. You have a minority faction that has taken over one of the two major parties and has decided that all they are going to do is block. And in a really perverse way, the more they block, the more their thesis that government is no good anyway becomes vindicated. And the more that ordinary people get frustrated, not just with the Tea Party Republicans, but with the Democrats. So this is one part of the perfect storm that I think is engulfing our politics and our economics. A second part is that we now have a president whose entire history, entire character, is built on the premise that his mission is to build bridges and overcome differences. Now that would be just lovely and admirable if you didn't have an anti-system party as the political opposition. But unfortunately, you do. And a moment that, in my view anyway, called for a Roosevelt or a Truman, instead has produced a president on the Democratic side who keeps thinking that if he just goes along with one more compromise, the Republicans will appreciate his good conciliatory nature, and the voters will reward him. Well, meanwhile, the economy keeps sinking, and so does his rating in the polls, and yet even barely more than 1 year out from the election, the conciliatory rhetoric is continuing to overwhelm the partisan rhetoric. He actually had one good line in the Labor Day speech that he delivered in Detroit, challenging the Republicans to start behaving as grown-ups. So we have a Democratic president who turns out not to have been well suited temperamentally, in my view anyway, for the crisis that he inherited, and historians and biographers over the next century will continue to debate why Barack Obama behaved as he did. But there's another part of the story. It's not just Obama's temperament or the extremism of the Tea Parties. It's the structural influence of the financial industry over the past 30 years, and its lock, unfortunately, on both political parties. And in these circumstances, it would have taken a president at least as radical as Roosevelt, probably more so, to say that we are going to have a dramatic break with the regime of finance, if you will, that has prevailed since the late 1970s. Now, if you think about it, what drove the economy off the cliff? Well, it seems to me that the biggest single cause was the deregulation of finance and the speculative activities that followed. As financial speculation created one crisis after another, the Federal Reserve pursued the disastrous course of providing easy money to bail out the casualties of the last crisis with more deregulation. And if you anatomize the housing bubble and the collapse that followed, and you go through the daisy chain, you see that unregulated mortgage bankers, financed by unregulated investment bankers on Wall Street, were originating mortgages whose main characteristic was that they were unlikely to be paid off. These were turned into securities with the blessing of corrupted bond rating agencies and sold off to unwary final investors. They were insured by credit default swaps, and none of this was regulated. All of it, even though it was the market, was totally non-transparent. And it was all done with no requirement of reserves. Now, as Nani Burns can tell you, the insurance industry, which did not collapse in this crisis, is built on a very careful system where you have to reserve against the risk of loss. But if you are AIG, or you are Goldman, or you are anybody else who writes credit default swaps, you don't have to put aside any reserves. And there was a law passed in 2000, sponsored by Senator Phil Gramm, Republican of Texas, on behalf of Enron, supported by Robert Rubin, Democrat of New York, signed by President Clinton in the last days of his presidency, that says that government cannot regulate most categories of credit derivatives either as securities or as insurance or as gambling. So the political power of the financial industry made sure that this speculative party would continue. And so what happens? It's the fall of 2008. History has handed this gift to Barack Obama. The economy is just unraveling that week in September of 2008. One domino after another falls. John McCain seems obviously unequal to the task. And Obama comes in with an opportunity to do a clean break with the past. What does he do? Well, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York is the operating institution that carries out the policies of the Fed. And Ben Bernanke, who totally missed this, had in effect, a second in command, who was the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, a guy named Tim Kuttner. And then you had Larry Summers, who was Bob Rubin's deputy, then succeeded Bob Rubin as Secretary of the Treasury. Kuttner was also a protege of Bob Rubin, and all these people were committed to deregulation. So Obama names Summers as his chief economic person. He names Kuttner as Treasury Secretary, and then just to frost the cake, he reappoints Ben Bernanke as chair of the Federal Reserve. It was as if Franklin Roosevelt had come into office in March 1933 and said to himself, I think I'll appoint Herbert Hoover's team. There was complete continuity of the dramatis personae and of the policies. And there was a really instructive debate that went on in the winter and spring of 2009 about what to do about the banks. And on one side of this debate was Sheila Bair, who was a holdover Republican appointee, who was the only radical in the room. And Elizabeth Warren, who got up to speed very quickly as the chair of the Congressional Oversight Panel. These two courageous women on one side, and the old boys on the other side. And the debate went something like this. Should we prop up zombie banks, banks that are insolvent in everything but name? Should we prop them up in order to restore confidence in the money markets? Citibank, Bob Rubin's bank, being the signal example, but not the only example. Or should we paper over the degree of loss and bail them out? And Sheila Bair, quite reasonably in my view, took the position that no, we got to see exactly how deep the hole is. We got to figure out how we fill the hole, how much taxpayer money, how much of a hit bondholders take, and throw out old management, as you do when the FDIC takes over a failed bank, and then get a clean institution that can go forward with a clean balance sheet. And they fought her tooth and nail. Now, Elizabeth Warren, who is one of my particular heroes, was very much on that side too. And you asked the question, how did somebody who was a professor of bankruptcy law at Harvard become so good at diagnosing the financial crisis and serving as a kind of loyal opposition to Kuttner and Bernanke and Rubin? And I was discussing this with her one day, and a kind of a light went on. Of course, what's a bankruptcy? A bankruptcy is a legal process by which you take stock of the assets of a failed enterprise, a company, or in some cases a country, or a bank, and you decide on what terms it is to continue, and how much goes to which of the creditors, and what it takes to have the asset restored to economic health. And so it was Elizabeth Warren's background and brilliance in bankruptcy law and practice that gave her insights into just how badly Team Obama was bungling the process of restoring the banking system to health. And by analogy, what Sheila Bair does as chair of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, when a medium-sized bank, she doesn't regulate the biggest banks, she regulates the medium-sized banks. The Fed, God help us, regulates the biggest banks, bank holding companies. But you know, let's say a $50 billion bank goes bust and it's FDIC insured and it's got $35 billion worth of assets. Well, the FDIC comes in, shuts it down, reopens it, makes sure that the depositors can get paid off, and then throws out management and either finds somebody to merge it into or reopens it with different management, runs it directly for a while. This was the antithesis of the Kuttner-Summers-Bernanke view of the world, which was keep existing management in there at all costs. And as a brilliant guy named Bill Black keeps pointing out, there has not been one single criminal prosecution of these people, even though the whole system was fraudulent. I mean, if you look at subprime, if you make a loan where you get a higher rate of return because the loan is very likely to fail, and you pass the risk off to somebody else, and you bribe a credit rating agency to certify that this is good paper, the whole thing is fraudulent. Black calls this control fraud because it's fraudulent from the top down. The fraud is inherent in the business model. And yet, when it was proposed that there be an interagency task force to look into criminal prosecutions, this was squelched at the highest level of government. So the third problem, in addition to an extremist Republican Party taken over by the Tea Parties and a president given to temporizing, was a kind of a bipartisan hegemony, a word that I don't use lightly, both because it's a multi-syllable word and an esoteric one, but it means domination of politics by the banking industry. And Dodd-Frank, as good as it was, did not get at the heart of the business model that caused this collapse. And right now, Dodd-Frank is being undone brick by brick by the rulemaking process. There are about 1,000 representatives of bankers participating in the rulemaking process for every one representative of the public interest. One investment bank, I believe it's Morgan Stanley, has more people on one aspect of Dodd-Frank that affects derivatives than the entire Commodity Future Trading Commission, which regulates this. So the imbalance of political power is just extreme. So what you have here is a kind of a vicious circle or a downward spiral that is just made to order for the Tea Party, where government is not doing what it needs to do, either to reform the financial system or to put the economy back on track. And the more the crisis festers, the more that government fails to address an economic emergency, the more credibility the far right has. Barry, how much time do I have before the break?
5 or 10 minutes.
Another 5 or 10 minutes. Well, there are two huge myths at the center of public policy and public conversation. One is, and you hear this all the time, that there is a politically symmetrical blockage in Washington. Radicals on the left and radicals on the right are too dug into their own positions, and they just need to compromise so that we can get a reasonable kind of centrism. Now, anybody who believes that has been living on another planet. I mean, the Democratic Party is more of a centrist party than it was 2 decades ago, 3 decades ago, 4 decades ago, even 1 decade ago. And the Republican Party is much more of a far right party. And, you know, the British have a nice expression, horse and rabbit stew. It's an equal stew of 1 horse and 1 rabbit. And if you look at the kind of compromises between the Obama White House and the Tea Party Republicans, it's horse and rabbit stew. It's what we used to call salami tactics. We'll split the difference with you. Oh, that's not good enough? Okay, we'll split the difference again. Okay, we'll split the difference again. And what kind of a message does that send to the Republican Party? The message is don't give in on anything, and they will come to us. And yet, you have all kinds of opinion elites treating, I mean, third way and no labels. It's almost like every week another high-minded centrist group invents itself with the premise that all we need is a kind of a new centrism. It just ain't so. And the other myth, and this is really the corker, is that all we need is austerity. Right? The way out of a great deflation is that everybody should tighten their belts. Now, I don't know where these people learn their economics, because if you have 10% unemployment and purchasing power down And households having lost trillions of dollars of assets because of the decline in the value of their retirement savings, the decline in the value of their homes. So people are already tightening their belts, and businesses look at the lack of demand, and they don't hire new workers, they don't invest in new factories, or if they do, they put them in China. And the weakened balance sheets of the banks lead bankers to say, you know, if we make loans to small business, that's risky. We'd rather make our profits trading. So in this really sick deflationary economy, both parties are promoting different versions of more austerity. Now, what possible storyline could lead you to conclude that this is a good idea? Well, the storyline goes something like this. Businesses are holding back because they're not certain whether the government is going to get its fiscal act together. Businesses are worried about the debt to GDP ratio in 2021. I don't know how many of you are business people, or if you know business people, but I defy the austerity monger to produce one living, breathing business person who's worried about the debt to GDP ratio in 2021. That's not what motivates businesses to invest or not to invest. And of course, the proof of the pudding is that the U.S. government can borrow money for 30 years at 1.90%. That was yesterday's number on 30-year treasuries. Now, obviously, anybody who is willing to lend the U.S. government money for 30 years at a return of 1.9% per year is not exactly worried about inflation. So Paul Krugman uses this nice term, the confidence fairy, that somehow if the government gets the deficit down, the confidence fairy will come, and business will somehow regain its confidence and will invest again. This is just delusional, and it's really dangerous because the more austerity you pursue, the more you lock the economy into a pattern of self-deepening deflation. Now, I'm going to save the discussion of the politics, which is really the most interesting part, for after we stretch our legs. But let me conclude for now on this note. Between the two of us, my friend Barry Bluestone and I have written 4 or 5 books on the failure of laissez-faire. You can also consult the work of Paul Krugman or Joseph Stiglitz or Jeff Sachs. Pretty darn good company. And economic writers can demonstrate with recourse to history that unregulated markets do not, in fact, optimize outcomes, and occasionally they lead to catastrophic crashes. So we have more than proven the argument. The problem is that heterodox writers on economics seem to be doomed to a kind of labor of Sisyphus, where the case is won in both theory and practice, but lost in the domain of policy. And so the argument has to be made anew again and again and again. And if the debate is ever to be settled in favor of a more humane society and a durable managed form of capitalism, one must look beyond the economics to the politics. Thank you so much.